All right, good to go.
All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today's Tech Talk with the Tech Academy. We have one of our graduates, David Meyer, here with us, and they're going to do an introduction to Gatsby, React, and GraphQL. So thank you for being here and take it away.
Absolutely, yeah. Glad to be back. It's been a minute since I've been to one of these, so excited to talk to you guys. I'm just going to jump right into this because I do need to leave a little bit early. So was just going to start with like a quick introduction to like how I got to where I'm at today. So, had some education stuff. I went to high school. I was in like they called it a magnet program, which I always thought was funny, but it was kind of focused on like math and science and technology. So I kind of got to do some cool tech projects in high school. Not so much programming focused. It was more like green energy and those sorts of technology focused, but did have a lot of more focus on like the math and science. I did some like AutoCAD classes and some engineering adjacent things. So I think maybe that's kind of where I first got interested in this sort of stuff. And then I went to college after that because I just felt like I had to, like that was just what you're supposed to do. Kind of just waffled around for a few years. I went to Western Washington and Washington State University for about a total of 3 years. But I actually just ended up dropping out. It wasn't, I didn't have a clear direction, and I was there because I felt like I had to be there. And yeah, for some reason I was studying professional sales. Like I don't like selling. I've never liked that. So that's why I put the little why question next to there. But at that point where I was exiting college and just deciding what I wanted, I had a part-time job at Lowe's at that time. So I kind of just jumped into that fully. So at that point, this is when I was a team lead at Lowe's. So I was that for a couple of years. And then the bulk of my employment there, I was in project management. So for the installations and remodels, so everything from getting a new microwave put in to a full kitchen gut rebath, all that. So I got a lot of project management and customer experience from that job, and a lot of patience, I guess, for like retail employees and service workers and all that. Like, I've seen some stuff, man. It's crazy. I was really though just kind of burnt out and tired at that job. With all the COVID weirdness and stuff that was going on, it was strange. It was kind of writing on the wall that my position for that project manager was going to be outsourced. And so I had an opportunity to either move laterally within that company or leave respectfully. And so I took some time to think, and I actually just decided to exit the company at that point. And that was right around, so that was like at the very beginning of 2021. I enrolled in the Tech Academy fully online course in March of 2021. Took me a little bit longer than average, I guess, to finish. I did do the long overview of software development course, so that one is a little bit longer. So yeah, graduated in September of 2021 and got a job relatively quickly. I won't discount that. It was very quick. I got hired in November, so September, October, it was like 2.5, maybe 3 months from graduation to getting a job. I did work on that very extensively. I mean, that was my full-time job for 2 months, was looking for work. And I can talk about that more at the end if anyone's interested, but kind of got to keep moving. So moving into like the information part of this. So what is Gatsby? So at its core, Gatsby is a static site generator, which essentially is just like a software application that creates HTML pages from templates or components and a given like content source. So it kind of bundles all of these pieces together and then gives you finished like an HTML page that you would then see on your on the browser. It's used for dynamic content loading, which is kind of redundant because at this point, like everything is dynamic content practically on all websites. And just for like basic definitions of dynamic content is just like digital or other content that changes over time based on the data being received. So, a lot of social media stuff is dynamic content. You see a different post, you see the like counter change, you see all these different things. Like that's dynamic. It's changing. Gatsby is kind of like a modern approach to web development to kind of have that all go together. And it works with part of what is called the Jamstack, which I think is a funny name. But so Jamstack is basically, well, this is the definition I found online, which is that it's an architectural approach that decouples the web experience layer from data and business logic, improving flexibility, scalability, performance, and maintainability. That's really a lot of big words just to say that it splits out the application into these three components, which is the JavaScript, the APIs, and then the Markdown. So it's breaking it out into JavaScript, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with JavaScript, but it's a dynamic language that's used to do some logic, but also render markup or what something look like. So it works with the dynamic functionalities related to combining the data sources that you have with their specific UI elements that were made, and can do some logical things like sorting or finding certain items. Then another key part of the Jamstack is APIs. API at its core is it's just something that allows software to talk to each other. That's like the most basic way that I could put it. I should have took a picture of it, but there's this stupid joke that I've seen before where it's like a restaurant and you've got your back of house that does, makes the food and gets all that stuff ready. You've got your front of house, people who are at the table serving people and all that. And the analogy that I had heard was that like the waiter going in between the front and the back and getting the food for the customer and taking requests back and forth, like that's the API. Kind of silly, but that's the way that I think of it, is that an API is something that goes back and forth between different software, either asking for information or returning information. And I put here that it's request driven because you have to make a request to the API. You have to call the API. It's not something that's just available sitting out there. You have to say, hey, to this API, I want this response. Please send it to me. And then the final part of that is Markdown, which is just the source for the static HTML files. You may have seen Markdown before if you've used like Stack Overflow or if you've ever read like a README file. It's kind of like one step up above from like just plain text that's just symbols, and kind of a step down from a Word document. So again, it's just the source for static HTML files. Another aspect of Gatsby is that when it's building that bundle, it's only rendering like critical JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, like whatever it needs for that page. It's not compiling everything for your entire site every time you're trying to click something or go to a different page. It's only rendering exactly what it needs to render, and that's for the purposes of performance. If you have a smaller workload or a smaller amount of data you're processing, that request is going to get done faster than if you had a bunch of irrelevant information being loaded at the same time. Another big part of Gatsby is that it has what's called like a plugin architecture. And it has lots of different plugins that you can specify in the config file. So this is a little snapshot of the config file. And it's showing here there's an array of plugins, and these ones are related to images. So if this was in a Gatsby config file that I was working on, when I run the project, it knows to use these three plugins. They're kind of like imports. So different little pieces that you say, hey, I want this functionality and this and that. And the reason that you would specify specific ones is, again, for performance. So if you don't need 900 different features and options and everything in your project, don't include it, because it's going to waste time. So a plugin, there's a couple of different kinds of plugins. The main ones are like an integration or a source plugin, which they just pull data into Gatsby's like data layer, I guess you could call it, and it makes it available to get by the React components. Kind of a weird way to say that, but So you can get different source plugins. A big one is the image plugin, which as you see here, so Gatsby plugin image, Gatsby transformer sharp. The image plugins allow you to do some cool things when you are getting, like when you're specifying an image. So, normally in HTML, you would do something like make an image tag and say source equals whatever the source is, whether it's local or if it's hosted somewhere. And you say, okay, that's my image, I want it here. And then you go into CSS and say, here's what I want it to look like. Here's its width. Here's its height. I want it to be fixed. Here's an effect I want. A cool thing about Gatsby is using an image plugin, you can actually specify a lot of those things in the markup. So you can say, hey, I want a static image right here. I want the layout to be fixed. It needs to have a height of this, a width of this. And let's say you want like a blur effect while it's loading. You can apply all of that at the time in the markup, which saves you some time from having to go back and style the CSS, or like with debugging or just the dev process, you can get images closer to how you want them before even needing to go into styling, which just for me is kind of nice to see when I don't have crazy wonky images already popping up on the screen. So that's just like one small example of what a plugin could do with Gatsby. I kind of already touched on this, but so Gatsby is a static site generator, which means that it separates the content, so that just the data, the content, from the templates that are displaying that content. So think of it, it has a bunch of templates for, okay, I know kind of what the data will look like, but I don't know exactly what's going to go in it. So it's kind of in limbo. And then once that page is generated, the data gets pulled into the templates at build time. So when the project's being compiled, it gets that already, and then boom, serves you up that page. And that's contrasted to this being like generated at runtime. I don't really want to get into this because that's just not the purpose of this talk, but I did put some resources here for like runtime versus compile time, what the differences are here if anyone wants to take a look. But basically an external API, like I said, is putting the template together with that content and serving you a page. You don't need any server-side code. And the results of that are you have reduced latency associated with your database. This is a big one, is that you're not tied to a single CMS or a content source. In some traditional approaches, you had to use just one source of data. So like, let's say you're getting your data from WordPress or something. That was your only option. Or if you had, I don't know, a giant JSON file from a client that had all this data you need to show, like that could be the only thing you could use. But with Gatsby, you can pull in data from multiple different sources and then display them all on the same page or application, which is a huge benefit. And then you have like reduced site complexity. You have a little bit more security because you're only exposing a static page, which means they can't necessarily see as many of the ins and outs if they were looking to be malicious with your application. And this is a little less applicable, but it is important. You don't need to worry about load balancing. Since it is a static site, you can just host it on a content delivery network that can scale with the traffic. And I have some resources for what a CDN is here. Again, if anyone's interested, I'll make this PowerPoint available. Moving on. So if Gatsby generates a static site, how does it work with React? Oh, what did I do? Okay. So React is an open source JavaScript framework. So if you know JavaScript, React should be relatively simple to learn, relatively. If you know React, or if you know JavaScript, you will be able to learn React. That's the basics of that. Why is this doing this? It is the most popular library for creating user interfaces or UI. And a big thing about React is that it has a component-based architecture, which means that it is built up of these different components that can be, stacked on each other or work with each other, that then make up that whole page. This is something I don't want to get super into, but I think it is important to at least know on a high level. So there's something called the DOM, and React keeps track of a virtual DOM versus what the real DOM is. So just think of this as kind of a tree with a parent element up at the top, and then the parent may have some children elements that are relying on it, and so on and so forth. What React is doing is taking this snapshot and comparing it to what is really in the tree, and it's watching for differences between those two. And the important part of that is that when it sees a difference, it's going to do a re-render just on that component that it sees the difference in. The key here is that you don't need to re-render the entire page just to change one little spot. Say you have a dynamic light counter or something on a social media page, and the number would keep going up. If this wasn't in React, or was in some way where it didn't have a method to keep track of the DOM, you would have to reload the entire page every time you wanted to see that light counter go up, which maybe on something small like that wouldn't be a very big difference. But as you start scaling and getting larger, this benefit is huge to be able to have quick reactive sites that are only re-rendering and only consuming resources when that one little thing changes. So that's a high level of that. I do have some more resources available if anyone wants to dig into that more. React acts as like the view part of the MVC, or model view controller design pattern. I believe the Tech Academy goes over what MVC is, at least on a high level, which is fantastic because it's a very common design pattern. But basically what this means is there is a model. So the model is kind of like what is the data, just what is the data, all the stuff that we're using. There's the controller, which more relates to how are we going to manipulate this data, which data do we want to show, and then there's the view part, which is React in this example. React is what is the user going to see, and how will they see it? Is it going to be in a list item? Is it going to be in a table? That's all determined by your React component. And then just a link to the docs, which I think is a good place to start and come back to. And I'm constantly looking at React documentation. Going a little bit more into what I mentioned about the component-based design of React. So it's centered around components. Think of each UI element as a component. So I took this little snapshot from Twitter. Hopefully there's no weird headlines on here. Okay, I don't see any good. But I put some boxes around like what I would consider to be like elements or components. So obviously this whole page is the user interface. It's what the user is interacting with. But for example, we have this little sidebar. So you could think of the sidebar itself as a component. Breaking that down even further, this little explore in the settings section, these could be like sidebar item components. So you would have a parent, that's the sidebar, and then it's got children component, which are each of the individual sidebar components here. Or another example, this large image here could be like a featured story item. And then these ones below here could be like sub items or something like that. So there's individual component items as well as like the entire list of them. These are probably in like a container that's then being styled for each individual item. So a component should do something or show you something. Typically with React, it's showing you something, but you can do some logic as well. So let's say that, where's it going? Okay, so let's say the data for all of these featured items is somewhere. It's stored somewhere. It's not necessarily structured, and they want to display it by date. But in where they're stored, it may not necessarily already be in order. So the component, part of what it could do is look at the data and do some sorting. Something like compare the published date with the current date, and whatever the highest one is or smallest, show that at the top. So the thing that it's doing in that component is sorting, and then it's showing you these here. I also put that they should be able to exist independently, which is kind of true, kind of not. Like with my last example, where there's some logic being done to sort these, that logic would need to exist with the markup that shows the component. So they don't necessarily have to all exist 100% independently and be able to be like ran by themselves. I guess I just meant that they need to be in these modules that can exist independently or with one or two helpers. And another big thing is they should be reusable. You should be able to use this in multiple spots. I'd imagine that this sidebar could be used on multiple pages, or if this is like a featured image at the top of the page, this could be reused as well as the featured image spot, depending on what page you're on. So you want your components to be reusable so that you don't have to remake every single thing, especially if they're very similar. You can just say, hey, I already have a component that has markup that is similar or exactly what I want. I'm going to reuse featured item component instead of remaking things every single time. And then I have some learning sources here for React. I'm just going to go over these super quick, but they'll be in the PowerPoint. So there's Udemy, which I find it's kind of been a mixed bag. But if you look at the reviews, look at the number of people who have taken the course, if it's got 4 or more stars, it's probably going to be okay. There have been a few where I don't really like the teaching style of the instructor, but that's just kind of what you get with something like Udemy, where it is community-driven tutorials. So just keep that in mind. There is a lot of times a cost associated with the course, but they go on sale from time to time. Like I think I got a 30+ hour JavaScript course for like $15 or something. So that was a super good deal. And some companies also can offer you a Udemy business license as a way to like have you train and develop and get better. My company actually provided me with one of those. I was like a trial program for it. So I've been trying to use that too, just to show that I've used it, and I found it very helpful. So if that's a perk at a company, I would definitely recommend taking advantage of it. YouTube is super useful too. I learned a lot of React stuff on YouTube. Something that I highly recommend though is to actually code along with the instructor or the person giving the video. It just, at least for me, I can't speak for the people, but for me, like it just doesn't stick unless I'm doing it. And copying someone else, the way that they're coding it's a step up from just watching. But if you can then make some tweaks to it yourself, or try it again without the video and not just memorize how to do it, but try and work through that problem, that's where the learning happens. A couple different channels that I've looked at that I enjoy. Free Code Camp is another great resource. They have a lot of web development and programming tutorials in general. I have found them to be very useful. They've got like little quizzes and like interactive elements, and all around great site. I've got a few spots for project inspirations, or just different like types of things you can do that's slightly more interesting than tic-tac-toe. And I found this site recently called Dev Projects, which is it's more broad than just React, but it's kind of just it's a community where people are like sharing ideas or bringing up different projects they're doing. And like my cursory glance was that it seemed kind of like a more friendly version of Stack Overflow, but take that with a grain of salt. All right, moving on. So a few main features of React. So like I said, there's the virtual DOM versus the real DOM. The main benefit of that is to have those faster load times, where you are just reloading that component that changed, or just that section that changed. Reduces the resources that you need and increases the speed, and just all around works better. I could probably do a whole talk just on JSX, but I won't. JSX is essentially a combination of JavaScript and markup that is written in the like in the component itself. So I don't have the best examples, but if you look at this here, so this little section is making a function. This is just a JavaScript function called recent upload. Don't worry about this const. This is just assigning a JavaScript variable to like a placeholder constant image, which is super useful. But this JavaScript function is returning markup. So it's returning a div with, this is Tailwinds, you don't need to worry about that, but it's making a div. It's got some elements inside of it. And then it's rendering an image, which is using, if you see that it's in these squiggly brackets. So the squiggly brackets indicate that there is JavaScript being placed here. And this isn't the greatest example because the only JavaScript it's doing is just grabbing this variable and saying, hey, the source of this image is equal to the value for this variable, which in this case is a 50 pixel placeholder square. So it's just, this is a JavaScript function that returns markup and may do some JavaScript stuff inside of it too. This is another super basic example I found from W3, but essentially it's assigning a variable that is equal to some markup. So it's making a header that has some text in it, but if you'll notice inside of the header, there is squiggly brackets with some stuff going on. So this is just JavaScript. It's doing a JavaScript computation inside of the markup. And that's kind of where a lot of the power of JSX comes from. You know, this could be, instead of 5 + 5, it could be a variable first name. And first name could be coming from some other component, or it depends on what the user's putting in. So instead of having to type out my message to 900 different users, I can just use that as a variable and say, depending on what user is there, show their name. Super basic example, but that's kind of just the power of JSX. One last thing about React is that it has a lot of really cool things called hooks that give you more functionality. They are a little bit confusing, and I'm still kind of getting used to them. But on a high level, there are some items called like use state and use effect, which can keep track of the state of an object, like use state. So you could say, you know, hey, has this button been pressed? If this button has been clicked, set the state to true, else set it to false. And then you can do logic based on that true or false. Do something like change the background color to red or green, depending on if you push the button. Silly example, but that's the idea. This use effect hook is incredibly useful in my experience. It's essentially watching for changes in a dependency that you specified. So for example, I could tell it to watch out for when the window is resized, so when the browser window gets resized. If it gets below a certain amount, show different markup for the mobile. So I could have like desktop and then mobile, and maybe mobile just looks different and I can't style it with CSS. It has to be different markup. So using the use effect hook, it can watch and say, hey, when the browser gets below 768 pixels, don't show this top markup, just show the bottom markup. That's kind of the power of that use effect. There's tons of different things that you can do with it. I'd highly recommend, if you're trying to get into React, definitely look at hooks after you kind of have the basics down. Okay, gotta hurry up here. Okay, what is GraphQL then? So we know React, we know what Gatsby is. GraphQL is just a query language for APIs. It's literally, you're just saying, hey, here's the data that I want. Please send that back to me. You get exactly what you need as long as you specified it correctly. That contrasts the API model, where you just make a call to the API and get a buttload of information, and then your program has to parse through all that and get what you need. In GraphQL, you just ask for exactly what you need, and that's all you get, if that makes sense. So you can create a request for that data, like I said, and you get all that data with one API call instead of having to call multiple times. GraphQL kind of creates a schema to describe the possible data, and that kind of just relates to like the shape of the data, for a lack of a better way to say that. I do have more information on what a schema is linked here if anyone wants to take a look. But the most common function in GraphQL is just query. You're saying, my query is give me these 7 keys and whatever their values are. But you can also mutate data directly with direct GraphQL if you needed to change all IDs at this to whatever. A little more about GraphQL. So there's this cool little tool called graphical, which is kind of what this little spot in the right-hand corner shows. If you're running an application on localhost, you can get to it with the extension /__GraphQL, and it gives you, so like in this case, this is like a screenshot from a project I was working on. So this is the Explorer that gives you all of these different items. So in this case, I'm looking at something called component image, and then it shows all of the different like attributes and fields that come with that. So in this case, I'm looking, so this is the query that I've made. So I'm looking at component image, and then the image itself has a property called desktop image, which has a property called file, which has properties called file name and URL. So in that case, the return for that is I get this image called brain fatigue bar chart, whatever. So that's the image. And then it gives me the URL of where that's hosted. This is useful because this gives me an example of what the response will look like. So I'm querying a CMS database with this, and it's showing me what the response is. This is helpful because before I go into trying to make the components and do all that, I can see, okay, good, I do have a URL for my image. If I didn't do this step and something was wrong here, or I had a misnamed, or something was wrong with the data, and I just say, hey, Gatsby image, get me results from this query. And if there's a problem, it's just going to show an error on the screen. It's not going to tell me what's wrong. And so I'd have to then back up, go back through here, look through another query, and make sure that I'm getting the appropriate response. So it's super helpful for showing like the shape of your data when you're constructing queries in the components. You can do stuff like aliases. So I could say I just want to call this image. So every time I look for image, it's getting the Contentful component image, like the long name. So that can help with namings. You could pass in variables too. Like let's say I was looking for, I don't know, image where it's greater than a megabyte or something. I can do logic and search for different variables in here, or search for ID where ID is equal to 542. Like you can do that as well. Or just query a fragment, like a small part of a large component. Again, that's just based on performance improvements. So the gist of GraphQL is that it's just a querying language. It's used for requesting data. And then real quick, so Contentful or any sort of CMS is just a content management system. It's just where all of the data and the stuff, the images, everything is stored on, is saved on. It kind of serves as the back end for your application. One cool thing about at least Contentful, which is a specific CMS, is that it's front-end agnostic, which means you don't have to use a certain thing. Like you don't have to use React. You don't have to use whatever. So you can use many different technologies, which in my mind is a perk because it opens that up more. One other perk of Contentful is that you can enforce content modeling, which just means that you're saying how you want your data to look. I have a screenshot here. This is just part of a larger component, but you can see here. So this is for like a certain type of page called reports. It has 23 fields. You can specify if these are required or not. But it's got stuff like a slug, it's got metadata about the page, it's got a page title, a subtitle, and you can see like, okay, this is a short text. Page title, that means it's a reference to something else, so it probably links to another title. It's got a date and time field, so just lots of different things, and you can enforce how you want this data to look, which is just super helpful. Let's see if I forgot anything. Yeah, it gives you control over the content models, so that if you're not the one that's the editor and you're not the one putting the content together, you don't have to worry about someone doing it in the wrong format if you've already established what the content model looks like. So how does it work together? Let's just briefly go over everything now. So you've got your data layer where it starts. So your data has to be stored and sourced from somewhere. In this case, we're thinking of using a content management system that's all hosted externally, so that multiple people could work on a project and not worry about local files and all of that. So like I said, the CMS handles the data storage. You have content modeling there, so you know like the shape mostly of what your data will be. Getting that data from the content management system, you need a query. So what data do we need? Do we need every single record, just one? Do we need just one where it matches a certain ID? Which components will need the data? Because you need to make sure that you're passing data appropriately. You know, you don't want to pass header information to the footer or something like that. So make sure that you're giving the right components, the right data. What's the shape of the data? This should have already been established during the content modeling, and if it's not, let's take a step back. Okay, now we have that specific data. How do we render it? React. React will tell each component UI what it should look like. And that's what the markup is. You may do some data sorting if that's applicable, or if it wasn't done during the query stage. Keeping track of state and different things like that. So React is just rendering the data from that query in a specific way. And then Gatsby is just taking all of that, bundling it up, and then showing it to you on the browser, which is super useful. So summary, data comes from the CMS. You get the specific data that you want with a query using GraphQL. You render that data in a specific way based on how you've structured your React components. And then Gatsby packages that all up and shows it to you on the screen. There kind of are some more steps after that with like deployment and continuous integration, but we don't quite have time for that. So, but that's the basic of if you were doing local development, this is kind of the very high level process of where's your data? What data do you need? What do you want it to look like? Okay, package it all together, show it to you on the screen. And that is about it for me. Any questions or comments or anything? I've got like maybe 5 minutes if anyone has any questions. I have not been looking at the chat. I will look at that right now.
Yeah, great presentation, David. And I thought you were going to say 2 minutes that you had left.
I was trying, yeah, I mean, 2 to 5. I was trying to be polite.
Yeah,
I will share. I'll share the slides too. Can I just send those to Regina, or
yeah, just email me the slides and then I can share it with everyone who needed it.
Perfect. Cool. Yeah, there's lots of links and different things.
Yeah, so we do have a few questions. I don't know how long these questions will actually take to answer. So why don't you actually look at the chat, maybe see which one isn't going to take too long. And whoever has questions, you can feel free to, again, email me and I can share that with David and then get you back the answers. Also, David, would your LinkedIn be a good place for people to connect with you in case they do have questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
I can share that. I already
got the
link.
Yeah, if you
worries.
Have my LinkedIn? Perfect. If you could share that. And yeah, I really am about out of time. So please though, if you had a question I didn't answer or anything, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I will give the slides to Regina that she can share. There really are a lot of great resources that I've linked in there. Take your time, go through some of them. It's overwhelming, but I'm totally open to questions, or if you just want to come say hi, like whatever. Yeah. So absolutely.
No
that was a bit of a whirlwind, but I do need to.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
All good.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Yeah. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. All right.
Yeah, no, really well done. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, David. All right. So everyone else, thanks for joining today's Tech Talk. Also, next week, we have another Tech Talk, of course. It's actually going to be on object-oriented programming with SQL. It's going to be with one of our graduates as well. And here's a link where you can RSVP or check out the event. If I can get my mouse slide over, there we go. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining. I hope everyone has a great Friday, and I'll see you all next week.
Yeah, have a great weekend, everyone, and we'll see you next week.